I want to start off the first lecture with C.Wright Mills' account of celebrity in his book The Power Elite, which he wrote in 1956, and which lays the foundations for a sociological understanding of the role of celebrity in relations of power. Most people read it as being about the state and politics, about the military-industrial complex, and so on. Just to illustrate this point, here's a graphic meant to represent Mills's arguments, and you can see that celebrities aren't included. But he did also have a chapter about celebrities, where he said, a lot like Daniel Borstein, the people that are in film and television and theatre and so on are celebrated because they are displayed as celebrities. He says, a bit like Borstein, that they're celebrated because they occupy those positions that are recognised by the broader society, simply because of that, rather than because of anything else. So at first it looks similar to Borstein's account of people being famous because they're famous. But he also says a lot of other things. He goes well beyond it. There are 5 points you can draw out of his analysis that underpin any sociological account of celebrity and its relation to power. First, he says that what's changed over time has a lot to do with changes in forms of mass communication. He says there are personalities of national glamour, and that concept of the national is really important in the American setting. He's making this point about how there is a realm of communication and interaction and activity that operates at the level of the whole of the United States, that's distinct from what happens at more local levels. Then he says that all elites have to have some kind of relationship with these personalities of national glamour, with the celebrities, who are also part of the power elite. There's a kind of mutually beneficial relationship between these different parts of any country's elite, that they bounce off each other and leverage each other's status. This is a theme I've been trying to work through in all of these lectures, this leveraging concept. What happens is that politicians, for example, will gain some benefit out of their association with people that have a high status in other parts of society, in the realm of sport or filmmaking or music or television or whatever. The important point is that the celebrities need to be seen as an important part of the way in which a country's whole elite operates, and that they serve a particular function for those other elites in terms of visibility and attracting attention. I've talked about this a bit more in a previous lecture, but you get this theme in Mills as well. Mills was arguing that the capacity to become visible to a larger audience, that kind of mass visibility, had become a really important part of the way in which status and prestige operated. You could argue that in fact it always has been, and that's been my point about, say, the way in which Queen Elizabeth I operated, and various other characters throughout history. But you could say that what changes in the way this works is the role of the mass media, in the way in which the media have become more mass in the sense of being able to be available to an ever-increasing audience. And that was the point I was making in the industrialization of celebrity lecture. He's saying that if you want to have a high status and have any prestige in the United States in the 1950s, then you have to make some kind of connection with the world of celebrities. You have to have that kind of visibility on a relatively large stage, or you will just be treated as a non-entity. He says you will fade from the national scene. The second thing he draws attention to is the whole notion of café society. That's a concept that's worth trying to get your head around, because it was really important, especially around the beginning of the 20th century, in terms of the way in which all these dynamics and mechanisms worked in countries like the US. The term Café Society was invented by a journalist called Maury Paul, and he defined it as that group of people who meet in public, who interact in public instead of visiting each other in each other's homes. He's talking about the creation of a public space where people interacted and socialized as distinct from in their own homes, that projected itself out into a broader kind of public that was being photographed and reported on in newspapers. This relates to the point I was making in a previous lecture about how the audience for newspapers was rapidly increasing. It was creating this imagined community of people who watched a small group of people through newspapers and later through television interact with each other, have a good time, and so on. Mills said that café society is actually a modern American version of what in countries like France and Germany were the salons that aristocrats set up to have a gathering of people, in fact in their own home, in their own lounge rooms, but without the benefit of that kind of projection through the mass media. He says that salons never took off in the US because there was this alternative. It was possible to produce a mass media version of the same thing. You might remember that when I talked about salons in an earlier lecture, I said that programs like Oprah Winfrey are essentially a salon projected out onto a global stage, with the benefit of television, and Mills's point was that that has always been the way it's worked in the US. So what is Café society? It's the world of restaurants, nightclubs, coffee shops, parties, but in particular locations, and that's important too. All that really matters is Café society in centres of national, economic and political activity like New York that are visible to a broader stage, to the national scene. What happens in this world is this constant search for recognition, the aspiration towards having your photograph taken, being reported on in the newspaper and having your activities reported on. The whole point is to make sure that particular individuals are seen in proximity to others and that you're located in the right kind of place. The third idea you get out of Mills is his observations about the role of gender. He said that the role of women, especially young women, is central in the world that he was describing. They play an important part in the way celebrity identities and conceptions are spread throughout society, in the way celebrity gets turned into a commodity that has a certain kind of value. He says that among those whom Americans honour, none is so ubiquitous as the young girl, that it is as if Americans had undertaken to paint a continued national portrait of the girl as queen. He says continued because the character that's portrayed changes all the time. What emerged was the concept of the it girl, the girl who is currently the character that everyone pays attention to. And the it girl always has a limited lifespan. That's Mills's point, that she constantly has to change. This is what he says. Everywhere one looks there is this glossy little animal, sometimes quite young and sometimes a little older, but always imagined, always pictured as the girl. She sells beer and she sells books, cigarettes and clothes. Every night she is on the TV screen, and every week on every other page of the magazines. And at the movies too, there she is. He wrote this in 1956, but he was actually talking about what had started to happen since about the 1920s, and it's still happening now. There'll be a different kind of sense of it. That phrase will attach itself to different kinds of characters, but the basic principle is still the same. He says that the important element of this kind of celebrity character, the all-American girl, was this: doll face and the swank body starved down for the camera, a rather thin, gaunted girl with the wan smile, the bored gaze, and often the slightly opened mouth, for whom the tongue occasionally slides to ensure the highlights. Always prepared for the camera with the professional stance of the woman for whom a haughty kind of unconquerable eroticism has become a way of life, displaying the expensive look of an expensive woman who feels herself to be expensive. And you only need to look at the cover of any Vogue magazine to see the kind of image that Mills was talking about. The person who's often described as the original it girl is this one, Clara Bow. If you were historically inclined, you could argue with that and say no, there are actually earlier versions of her, like Lola Montez. You could argue that Lola was actually an earlier it girl, and of course there has been a constant stream ever since. This is Edie Sedgwick, Andy Warhol's girlfriend, for whom he coined the term superstar. The fourth point in Mills is the emphasis he places on competition, saying that it is an important underlying logic to the production of celebrity, that if you understand how competition works, you understand how celebrity works. He says that celebrities are the end point. He calls them the grand result of a system, a social, educational, cultural system that places a heavy emphasis on competing and on the notion of a difference between winners and losers. This is a standard feature of American culture, the importance of the concept of loser, and that of course everyone wants to be a winner. One important concept that isn't actually in Mills that's also relevant here is status conversion, the way in which if you achieve something in one area, then that fact alone enhances your opportunities, your outcomes in other areas, even though they don't necessarily have any relationship with each other. In other words, if you're good at being a sports person, then that is regarded as automatically meaning that you'll probably be good at other things as well. There's this way in which the achievement of status in one area can get constantly reproduced and capitalized on. It's a point I've made before about attention capital. Once you get any kind of attention, you can then convert that into other kinds of resources. It's what I called the Matthew effect in an earlier lecture, the way in which the rich get richer. So once you've achieved a status in some areas, you can then convert it into status in others. The final point that's really important is that celebrity plays an important role in the structuring of power. It has a hard edge to it. It actually plays a role in how populations are governed, the way they are controlled, the way in which they are managed. When you look closely in political theory at the work of writers that have been influential up until the 20th century, like Mandeville and Montesquieu, then you can see in their writing a sense in which the governance of any group of people is significantly enhanced by somehow managing people's desire for recognition, their desire for acknowledgement that what they have achieved is recognized by the society around them. The recognition of merit, of value, of achievement by a central authority, in that context by the monarch, was seen as very important in promoting a certain kind of everyday culture in which people thought of themselves as virtuous members of their commonwealth, of their society, of their nation, whatever word you want to use. Mills agrees that the controlled management of status and recognition is an important element of the way in which any mechanism of government operates. And what has happened since the early days of this kind of idea is that the character, the personality that recognises the achievement shifts from being the sovereign, from being the monarch, to being the public more broadly. Instead of it being the king recognising your achievement, it becomes, say, Australian society that recognises you. And that runs in parallel to the way in which political life changed generally, to the way in which power and sovereignty shifted from individual monarchs to the people more broadly. Every Australia Day, when those awards are given out, Australian of the Year and various other kinds of awards that people get, that has a history to it as a way of managing a population by making people feel good about being a part of a particular national group, somehow feeling like they are part of the achievement that has been recognised. Instead of seeing elites and aristocracies as having power, as being more powerful, Mills's argument is that in fact what happens is that their visibility puts them in a particular position within all these mechanisms, and it's this visibility that plays an important part in their capacity to command the attention, the recognition of a large population. This almost inverts the way in which we usually think about it. We usually think of, say, queens or kings as being visible because they're powerful. But what Mills does is he inverts that. He says, no, they're powerful because they're visible. That might be a strange concept to get your head around, but it's worth going with it for a while and seeing how far you can make it work. Because that visibility puts them in a particular relationship of power, and it requires certain kinds of performance from them. And it's that visibility that becomes a vehicle for the way in which they operate within power relationships, as a focus of the attention that everyone pays to them, as examples of what kind of person you want to be. There had been a focus on a particular kind of recognition, what Brodie calls the engines of fame. So that's titles like Sir So-and-so or Lady So-and-so, getting prizes, getting medals, that kind of formal recognition. And that's what I've talked about so far. But the point Mills makes is that it's equally important to look at the informal engines of celebrity, like visibility in the media, star status in things like film or theatre, in sport and so on. So there are a number of different threads to the way in which that increased visibility operates in the dynamics of power relations. Mills's account of celebrity is very rich. There's lots of ideas in there, so I'll recap briefly. The 5 important points are that celebrities should be seen as part of the power elite, that their role in the dynamics of a particular kind of public sphere, Café society, was crucial, that celebrity society should be seen as deeply gendered, that celebrity is anchored in the dynamics of increasing competition, and that it plays a central role in the exercise of power, more specifically the management and governance of the mass of people in any complex society. The next lecture will be about celebrity and the concept of status.